This is CNN Breaking News.
Hello, I'm Wolf Blitzer. It's 1 p.m. here in Washington, 7 p.m. in Stockholm, 8 p.m. in Aleppo. Wherever you're watching from around the world, thanks very much for joining us. Up first, breaking news. There are new developments in Syria right now following that U.S. military airstrike. President Trump ordered the strike in response to the horrific chemical weapons attack just a little while ago. The White House released this photo of the president consulting with his national security team after the strike was launched. And right now, members of the Senate are getting a closed-door briefing on Syria. The attack is the first direct military action by the United States against the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria's 6-year civil war. The U.S. launched 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles at an airfield in Syria. It's believed to be the base where Syria launched this week's horrific chemical weapons attack. Let's go right to our Pentagon correspondent, Barbara Starr. Barbara, we're hearing the U.S. military is now looking at new evidence potentially showing Russia was complicit. What are you learning?
Wolf, we have just concluded what is known as a background briefing here at the Pentagon. Senior officials coming out to brief reporters, not allowing their names to be used because they said they wanted to offer as much detail as they could, so we can't tell you who they are. But these two senior officials had a good deal of new information, and a lot of it did center on Russian involvement. Here is what we know. They now are saying that they will investigate any credible claims of Russian complicity in the nerve agent attack in Idlib province. In other words, the event that set all of this off. They don't know at this point if the Russians were involved, how involved they were, what the Russians knew. But they are now telling us that there was a Russian aviation unit at the base that the U.S. struck last night, and those Russian pilots would have known about every mission flying out of that base, and one of those missions was the chemical mission that went to attack in Idlib. So that is one piece of evidence. How much that they want to find out. How much did the Russians there know? What did they know about it? What did they know about what the Syrians were up to? One of these officials, U.S. officials, now telling us that the U.S. military will, quote, more aggressively look at whether there is now a full-blown Syrian chemical weapons program. What they are saying is that they believed the Russians back in around 2013 or so, when that whole program was going on to have the Syrian regime get rid of its chemical weapons, and that they can't trust the Russians now because of these recent events. But this gets complicated. They're saying they believe the Russians. The U.S. intelligence community has long said that Assad may have held on to a small portion of his chemical weapons, could always make more, and that he had the expertise, the technical expertise in the country to do that. So they're saying they're going to aggressively investigate it. But this is something that has been out there for some time. We have seen chemical after chemical attack in Syria for years now. So this is nothing new. Maybe more attention's being paid, but people knew it was out there. There's no question about that. One of the big elements that they want to find out revolves around one single aircraft. On the day of the attack, you had the initial detonation of this chemical bomb. Then people rapidly get to a hospital, they try and get medical care. Some hours after people are at the hospital, another weapon drops from an airplane overhead. The belief is that airplane was trying to destroy evidence at the hospital of a chemical attack. Who was flying that airplane? What we were told in this briefing is that right now, the Pentagon does not know if that airplane that might have been trying to destroy evidence at the hospital and kill even more people, it was Russian-made, but was it being flown by Syrians, or was it being flown indeed by the Russians? There's only two choices in Syria. It's either the regime or the Russians. All of this now opening the door in a complex fashion to trying to find out how involved the Russians really were in what was going on, and this sort of new thing about, is there really a Syrian chemical weapons program? I think it is fair to say we have seen so many of these chemical attacks, whether it's chlorine or nerve agent before. This was not a secret to the world, but it looks now like the Trump administration wants to take a closer look at it, Wolf.
Well, if there is evidence of direct Russian involvement in this gas attack against these civilians, that will significantly escalate the tension, not only between the U.S. and the Bashar al-Assad regime, but with Russia itself. It's going to seriously complicate this relationship.
Well, I think that is exactly why, so far, we are only seeing these so-called background briefings. We are seeing these statements. I think it is fair to say the Trump administration perhaps not ready yet to put its name to it. We are just hours into this situation of looking at potential Russian involvement. What the officials kept saying to the reporters in the room was, if we find credible evidence, then we will investigate it. But clearly, they have some reason to believe that this is a matter worth investigating. This is not something that is off the table, that is beyond the logical reason to go take a look at it. The door is very much open now to looking at how much the Russians knew, simply from the standpoint at a base level. They were at the base. They were at the base that was attacked. There was a Russian helicopter unit. Those people would have known what was going on there.
Barbara Starr with new information at the Pentagon. The headline: the U.S. military is looking into any evidence that the Russian government was complicit in this chemical weapons attack. Barbara, we'll get back to you. The U.S. airstrike on Syria certainly marks a very dramatic shift by President Trump and his administration. Just earlier in the week, they had signaled that removing the Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad from power was not necessarily a priority. Let's go to our senior White House correspondent, Jeff Zeleny. He's down in Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach with the president. Jeff, are you hearing anything from the president today? We are getting word that Sean Spicer, the White House press secretary, may be holding a briefing very soon.
He is indeed, Wolf. Sean Spicer is here near Mar-a-Lago, and he may be briefing. In fact, he will be briefing reporters shortly. But before he begins that, we are talking to administration officials this morning who are saying this. They said that they are not as interested in regime change, but changing the actions of Bashar al-Assad. We'll see if that actually happens there. But, Wolf, I think just taking a step back here to take size of how abrupt and swift this development was this week. It started at 10:30 Tuesday morning when the president saw those images coming in from Syria. He ordered a few actions and options from his national security team on Wednesday. Again, we, of course, heard his remarks in the Rose Garden, saying that he was deeply moved and affected by this. But, Wolf, we're also learning today, as the president was flying down here to Florida aboard his plane, Air Force One, around 1 o'clock yesterday or so, he had a secure meeting aboard Air Force One to begin talking about these options, these strategies. Shortly after that, he came back to the press cabin where I was, and a few reporters asked him about Assad, and he said something has to happen. Well, of course, indeed, he had the options on the table at that point. And last night, he made the final decision around 4 o'clock or so before that dinner with the president of China, Wolf. So here we have one foreign policy situation playing out as he was preparing to meet with, the other leader of a world superpower here. But this is something that the president did not discuss this morning when he was sitting down for a bilateral meeting with President Xi Jinping. This is what he said when asked about Syria.
Thank you very much.
So, Wolf, you can hear the president there not answering questions a short time ago at Mar-a-Lago about Syria here. He is letting the actions last evening speak for themselves here. But quite frankly, Wolf, there are questions from even lawmakers and others who applauded the president for his action last evening, for him to spell out more of a concrete strategy with Syria going forward here. So as we
Jeff,
await that
I'm going to interrupt for a moment. Sean Spicer, the White House press secretary, is briefing reporters.
Okay. Do you want that? Do you understand that? What's that?
What would you like to do?
Off. It's off.
This is the full camera.
Yeah, off.
Lock the camera here.
Off. Everything's off. I just.
Okay, apparently this is off camera.
Okay, let me just, I've got Michael Anton here with the National Security Committee. I think with respect to President Xi's visit, we intend to have a readout later. Hopefully we can, we'll gather with the pool at the very least. We'll see what the rest of the day looks like about trying to get back over here as well, but we'll continue to update that. I just wanted to provide a little bit of a tick-tock on the President's action. I know there's been a lot of interest in this, and then we can take a few questions on this. But with respect to the action that the President took in Syria, and the questions regarding the timeline, let me just kind of walk you through it. On Tuesday at about 10:30 in the morning.
Hey, Jeff, it's a little awkward. Apparently, he does not want this briefing to be on camera. As a result, they've told the pool cameras there at that briefing to get off of him. We're hearing his audio, but I take it this has now been designed as an off-camera briefing. In other words, it's on the record, but we're not allowed to shoot it. Is that right?
Wolf, that is our understanding, and just to give you a bit of a sense of location and place here, we are down the road a bit from Mar-a-Lago at the White House workspace, the filing center where all reporters are working here. And Sean Spicer was doing an interview with Fox News earlier on camera, and several reporters, including CNN, Jim Acosta, and myself here, asked Sean Spicer to answer questions on camera. They said they would do a briefing, but preferred to be off camera for some reason here. Wolf, they are wanting the president's words from last night to be the main message of this administration here, but a bit unusual given the day after a major military operation, the first in this administration here, to not have more on-camera briefings here. Apologies for being sort of in the weeds with our viewers here, but Sean Spicer is now talking to reporters, taking some of those questions, and really what he's doing is walking through a timeline that I just laid out for you a second ago of the last few days or so here that led up to this decision last evening here at Mar-a-Lago.
All right, a little awkward moment, but it's inside baseball as far as TV coverage of the Sean Spicer briefing is concerned. We'll get back to you. Jeff Zelony's down in Palm Beach, Florida. The United States informed Russia before launching the Tomahawk cruise missiles into Syria. About an hour before, Russia has reacted quickly with more than just heated words. Let's go to Moscow. Paula Newton is on the scene for us. Paula, first of all, what is Russia saying about the U.S. airstrike, and perhaps even more importantly, what are they doing?
Well, if we get to what they're doing first, they suspended that air safety communication. That's the communication that makes sure that U.S. and Russia don't have a collision in the skies over Syria. But on top of that, they are sending a warship out back to the sea off the coast of Syria, and they are saying that they are building up their anti-missile defenses. What does all that mean? At this point, it hadn't meant much, Wolf, until that explosive news, really, from Barbara Starr. And when we get to the news about going back to what Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, said, Russia was either complicit or incompetent. And it seems to me, in speaking with Barbara Starr, the Pentagon is saying, look, we're going to try and find out from Russia if they did use chemical weapons. How come you didn't know that they had them? Or did you know that they had them and you knew they were going to use them? We obviously are just starting to learn this, Wolf, and we'll get reaction to you as quickly as we can. The main problem here is that there is no arbiter, there is no referee that is going to decide this. Russia continually says that, look, you have no evidence and you can't prove that even Syria was, the Syrian government was the perpetrator of that attack. I want you to listen now to the Deputy UN Envoy for Russia speaking just a few moments ago at the UN Security Council meeting. Take a listen.
We describe that attack as a flagrant violation of international law and an act of aggression. We strongly condemn the illegitimate actions by the U.S. The consequences of this for regional and international stability could be extremely serious.
Now, Mr. Safronov did more than that. He seemed to be taunting Nikki Haley, the U.S. representative there, by saying, we're not going to hold up any photos, but what about the airstrikes and what they have, your airstrikes and what they've done to children in Mosul? And here's the interesting part, Wolf. He just said that, look, we're not the ones that are afraid of an independent investigation into this chemical attack. You are afraid. The United States is afraid of an independent investigation into this attack. Well, suffice it to say that once Russia learns the news of what the Pentagon Pentagon is claiming that they may or may not know about this attack, we will once again have a fairly strong reaction from Russia.
Yeah, this tense relationship between the U.S. and Russia looks like it's going to get a whole lot worse. Nikki Haley, the United States ambassador to the United Nations, is speaking at the UN Security Council on this strike. Let's listen.
Have terrorized its own people. It has murdered hundreds of thousands and displaced millions. It has broken international law and violated numerous UN resolutions. It has committed criminal acts that shock the conscience of all humanity. The international community has repeatedly expressed its outrage. The Joint Investigative Mechanism has found beyond any doubt that the Syrian regime has used chemical weapons against its own people multiple times. On Tuesday, the Assad regime launched yet another chemical attack on civilians, murdering innocent men, women, and children in the most gruesome way. Assad did this because he thought he could get away with it. He thought he could get away with it because he knew Russia would have his back. That changed last night. As I warned on Wednesday, when the international community consistently fails in its duty to act collectively, there are times when states are compelled to take their own action. The indiscriminate use of chemical weapons against innocent civilians is one of those times. The United States will not stand by when chemical weapons are used. It is in our vital national security interest to prevent the spread and use of chemical weapons. Our military destroyed the airfield from which this week's chemical strike took place. We were fully justified in doing so. The moral stain of the Assad regime could no longer go unanswered. His crimes against humanity could no longer be met with empty words. It was time to say enough, but not only say it, it was time to act. Bashar al-Assad must never use chemical weapons again, ever. Now, while the Syrian regime is responsible for the chemical weapons attack, it is not the only guilty party. The Iranian government bears a heavy responsibility. It has propped up and shielded Syria's brutal dictator for years. Iran continues to play a role in the bloodshed in Syria. The Russian government also bears considerable responsibility. Every time Assad has crossed the line of human decency, Russia has stood beside him. We had hoped the Security Council would move forward, but Russia made it known, as it has done 7 times before, that it would use its veto once again, covering up for the Assad regime. Further delay by compromising with Russia for a watered-down resolution would have only strengthened Assad. Strengthening Assad will only lead to more murders. We were not going to allow that. But it's even more than that. Russia is supposed to be a guarantor of the removal of chemical weapons from Syria. Think about that. Russia is supposed to have removed all the chemical weapons from Syria. But obviously, that has not happened, as innocent Syrians continue to be murdered in chemical attacks. Let's think about the possible reasons for Russia's failure. It could be Russia knowingly allowing chemical weapons to remain in Syria. It could be that Russia has been incompetent in its efforts to remove the chemical weapons. Or it could be that the Assad regime is playing the Russians for fools, telling them that there are no chemical weapons, all the while stockpiling them on their bases. The world is waiting for the Russian government to act responsibly in Syria. The world is waiting for Russia to reconsider its misplaced alliance with Bashar Assad. The United States will no longer wait for Assad to use chemical weapons without any consequences. Those days are over. But now we must move to a new phase, a drive toward a political solution to this horrific conflict. We expect the Syrian regime and its allies to take the UN political process seriously, something they have not done up until this point. We expect Russia and Iran to hold their ally accountable and abide by the terms of the ceasefire. We expect this Council to speak loudly and forcefully when the regime or its allies undermine the political process, and countless of our own resolutions. The United States took a very measured step last night. We are prepared to do more, but we hope that will not be necessary. It is time for all civilized nations to stop the horrors that are taking place in Syria and demand a political solution. Thank you. I will now resume my function as the President of the Council, and I give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
All right, so there you heard the United States ambassador to the United Nations well, actually, let's listen in. This is the Syrian representative to the United Nations speaking before the Security Council.
That joined us in calling for the convening of this urgent meeting. I have a question at the very outset to the Under Secretary General, who stated that the Syrian Arab Republic perpetrated an act of aggression without defining that act by the terms of the Charter of the United Nations. The United States at 3:42 at dawn today, April 7, 2017, waged a barbaric, flagrant act of aggression against a base of the Syrian Arab Air Force in the central area of the country, using a number of missiles, which led to a number of martyrs, many injured, including women and children, and wide-ranging material damage. This treacherous act of aggression is a grave violation of the Charter of the United Nations, as well as all international norms and laws. The United States attempted to justify it with empty pretexts, fabricated arguments, claiming that the Syrian Arab Army had used chemical weapons in Khan Sheikhoun without genuine knowledge of what happened, without identifying who was responsible. The very same pretext shouted out by terrorist organizations as well as their handlers in Washington, Ankara, Riyadh, Doha, Tel Aviv, London and Paris, as well as their media. The Syrian Arab Republic has stressed that the Syrian Arab Army does not have chemical weapons in the first place, and that it would never use such weapons in any of its operations against armed terrorist groups, that it condemns the use of such weapons as being unjustified under any conditions. Let me stress that it is well known that those weapons have been used and stockpiled in many parts of Syria by terrorist armed organizations in cooperation, or rather with a wink and a nudge, by some ruling regimes in the region and outside, including Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and some European states. They completely ignore all the facts and documented information on the use of chemical weapons by terrorists in many parts of the Syrian Arab Republic. This aggression would surely send erroneous messages to those terrorist groups, emboldening them to use chemical weapons in the future and to continue perpetrating terrorist acts against the Syrian civilians. Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIL, both terrorist organizations and associated terrorist organizations, following this aggression, did wage many attacks on many parts of Syria. The Syrian Arab Army and its allies in the war against terrorism are confronting them, despite desperate attempts to support them. The American aggression is under this umbrella. This condemnable aggression is a grave extrapolation of the same erroneous American strategy that began 6 years ago, one of providing all forms of assistance to what the United States called moderate armed opposition groups. This strategy harms counterterrorism by the Syrian Arab Army and its partners. It makes the United States of America a partner of ISIL and Jabhat al-Nusra and other terrorist groups that since day one of the unjust war against Syria have attacked army positions and military bases as well as the infrastructure. Let me recall in this council that the United States of America leads a purported alliance against ISIL. However, the real achievements of that coalition is to kill civilians and to strike at infrastructure in Syria. Its real objective is to weaken the Syrian Arab Army and its allies when confronting terrorist groups. In this regard, we see the airstrike by the aircraft of this coalition illegally against the Syrian Arab Army in the Jabal Tharda in the city of Deir ez-Zor on 17 September 2017 in an attempt to protect ISIL elements falling between Syrian and Iraqi territory and opening a corridor for them. Today's aggression aimed at saving the Jabhat al-Nusra following the grave damage that was done to them by the Syrian Arab Army and its allies in the center of the country following their attack on cities and peaceful villages in the region. Let me also stress that media reports tell us that the U.S. Congress some time ago approved a law allowing the U.S. administration to send manpads to armed terrorist groups in Syria. We have warned only 2 days ago in this very council that these colonialist permanent member states in the Security Council, the three colonialists, have a renewed appetite to renew their lies and their stories that have been spread by the United States and the United Kingdom 14 years ago in this very hall to justify the destruction and occupation of Iraq, using a major lie being WMDs. Perhaps history has come full circle now in a regrettable scenario when we saw Secretary of State Colin Powell at the time trying to delude the international community and the United Nations to justify the aggression of his country against Iraq by talking about highly credible information. Today, the United States of America, in its policy, in an attempt to justify its aggression against Syria, is using fabricated information provided by the Jabhat al-Nusra terrorists. This aggression incontrovertibly proves that Syria has been correct, that successive American administrations will not change their sterile policies, which is to target states, to make peoples kneel to their will and spread hegemony around the world. International public opinion, the people of the free world have no doubt that successive United States, UK and French administrations for decades have not cared for democracy or freedom or human rights. Indeed, let alone the well-being of peoples or their security and stability. These are just pretexts to wage war, to occupy other states, to divide them, to control their wealth and energy resources. What is truly disgusting today is that these governments that supported the Wahhabi thinking, the terrorist extremist ideology of the Al Saud entity since its creation, is today orchestrating terrorism and investing in it without any care for the lives of people, even their own peoples, when terrorism reaches their own threshold.
We've been listening to the deputy Syrian ambassador to the United Nations, Mansour. He's speaking right now. A very, very different assessment, clearly, than what the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, just reported, and earlier the Russian ambassador to the UN Security Council. Lots to to unpack right now. I want to bring in our panel of experts. Joining us, our Chief National Security Correspondent Jim Sciutto, CNN political analyst David Gregory, CNN military and diplomatic analyst, former State Department and Pentagon spokesman John Kirby, also the former U.S. Congresswoman Jane Harman, now Director and President and CEO of the Wilson Center here in Washington. And Jim Sciutto, let me get to Nikki Haley first, because she was very precise. She went after the Iranian support for the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad. She went after the Russian support, and she said the world is waiting for the Russian government to act responsibly. This comes after Barbara Starr is reporting a little while ago that the Pentagon is now investigating possible Russian involvement in that initial chemical attack that killed so many civilians, including kids.
And Ambassador Haley also held out the prospect of further military action. She said, you know, if we're not satisfied, they're in effect keeping that option on the table. And it's interesting because it was a few days ago that Nikki Haley somewhat telegraphed this military action, because she talked about the possibility. She said when the international community fails, the U.S. may have to act on alone, and lo and behold, the U.S. acted on its own last night. I think that's important, in effect putting Russia, Syria, and others on notice. The other point I would make is the Syrian position you heard there, the Russian position before, that it's not clear who carried out this attack or what kind of attack it was. It's just frankly laughable, because they know that the U.S. has the capabilities and has said that they did. They tracked the planes from that airstrip over that target. They have infrared sensors, satellites that could track the explosions when the bombs dropped out of those planes. And we now know, based on Barbara's reporting, that they know it was a Russian-made plane that came back 5 hours later, dropped another bomb on the target, which is raising this question now as to whether the Russians were complicit here in trying to destroy the evidence. So the idea that this is an open question as to what happened here, not to mention Turkish doctors are doing autopsies on the victims and finding traces of sarin gas, etc. You know, it's pretty uncontrovertible. This was a chemical weapons attack, and the U.S. has the assets to determine who carried it out. So that's just a
John Kirby, the U.S. ambassador, Nikki Haley, also said 6 years into this war, 400,000, maybe 500,000 people already have been killed. These are Syrians, mostly civilian, millions more made homeless. The days are over for the U.S. to wait for some sort of diplomatic solution, especially when chemical weapons are used.
Yeah, that conveys to me that this wasn't a one-off. And when we heard Secretary Tillerson last night talk, it's sort of, he left that impression that there's no change to our policy in Syria. We're just going to do this as a retaliatory strike for a chemical attack by the Syrian regime. What I heard today was that they are perfectly willing to consider future military action against the regime. And so when you do that, now you really are tipping the scales in this civil war, which is something the United States hasn't done before. And I think it's, you know, that's going to beg, I would suggest much more conversation on the Hill about authorities.
Jane Harman, I want to bring you in. What does all this say to you? Where is the Trump administration going as far as military action in Syria is concerned?
Well, let me point out the irony of the Iranians possibly being part of the bad group when they were the victims of vicious chemical attacks by Iraq in the late 80s, and 100,000 Iranians were either killed or wounded from those attacks. And that set the stage for a lot of what came after. But on this, I applaud the Trump administration and Ambassador Haley for what they have just done. However, your question, I think, Wolf, is where's the strategy? This is a good tactic. If there's a follow-on that's finely targeted, I would probably be for that. But where's the strategy? Congress needs to get into this. Nancy Pelosi this morning was right when she called for Congress coming back into special session to debate and hopefully pass an authorization to use military force. I assume that the legal basis for this action by the Trump administration is the tired old AUMF that everybody but one, and certainly including me, passed in 2001, authorizing action in Afghanistan against those who attacked us on 9/11. This is a far stretch from that. The public needs to be brought into a debate about where we should be going, and it's years late. And we still don't have a real strategy for our actions in the Middle East. And this could be a huge credit to the Trump administration if they call for an AUMF, if Congress rises to the occasion, and if we do have a strategy that's well understood and that is effective.
Everybody stand by. David Gregory, we're going to get to you in a moment. We got to take a quick break. There are other developments emerging right now. Syria, as you just heard, declaring that the strikes make the United States a partner of ISIS. Will this embolden the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad? That and much more when we come back. We're following the breaking news. Our Pentagon correspondent Barbara Starr reporting that the Pentagon is now investigating possible Russian involvement in that chemical attack in Syria that killed so many civilians, including lots of children, and clearly had a huge impact on President Trump and his going forward in ordering that Tomahawk cruise missile strike against that Syrian air base last night. David Gregory, you've been watching all of this unfold. Give us your thoughts on where the situation stands right now.
Well, I'm really focused on where the situation is going to stand. How does President Trump want this to end? I thought his UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, was incredibly strong, a lot stronger than him, frankly, and more thorough and more plain-spoken in laying out the case for this strike and a strong takedown of Russia, something that he, the president, as John was just saying, has not done himself. But his ambassador at the UN has been very forceful in blaming Russia appropriately for supporting this tyrant and killer in Syria and facilitating his chemical weapons program. And they have to answer for the fact that those chemical weapons in that program still exist, when apparently with the Obama administration, everybody was so excited that instead of a strike, we were able to get those weapons put away. So this is a forceful response from President Trump, but what now? Either they want Assad never to use chemical weapons again, in which case, what's that negotiation like with Russia to make that happen, and can you trust the Russians if they say it'll make it happen? Or do they want regime change? Because, frankly, this administration is saying one thing one day, one thing another. That is really sloppy at the very least and strategically dangerous. If they are going to, and again, we are setting ourselves up, the United States is setting ourselves up for a real showdown with Russia. And that's the story we're going to be looking at hard in the next few days.
And maybe Iran as well.
Right.
And you heard what the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, just said, not just going after the Russians, but going after the Iranians, who are deeply involved in supporting the Bashar al-Assad regime through the various militias, including Hezbollah. William Cohen is joining us. He was the Secretary of Defense during the Bill Clinton administration. You have confidence, Secretary Cohen, in the direction of this Trump administration strategy in dealing with the Syrian regime?
Well, we don't know the strategy. We know that there was a strike, and the question will become, is there a comprehensive strategy looking at both Syria, Russia to be sure, but also Iran, and maybe even Hezbollah? There has to be a comprehensive strategy dealing with the entire region. Otherwise, we're going down an alley in which we're not sure where the end of that's going to be. So I applaud what President Trump has done. And I believe that Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis have really made a case to President Trump to take this action, and I'm glad he has done so. But I think taking it a step further, we have to see what the plan is, and I agree that Congress has to be brought in. They have to be briefed. They have to be brought on board, because this is going to be much bigger than one strike. If others are to follow, there has to be a much greater participation by Congress.
Because as you know, Secretary Cohen, this changes the overall U.S. strategy for 6 years of this civil war, of this brutal war in Syria. The Obama administration hit various ISIS targets in Syria, but never once went directly after a Syrian government military position, a position of the Syrian regime. All of a sudden now, President Trump orders a strike against the Syrian military base. This changes the overall U.S. direction, right?
It does change the policy towards Syria, to be sure. I want to make one other point. When the Russians say that this is either a violation of international law, I mean, really, the Russians shot down, or their pawns shot down, the Malaysian jet 17, as I recall, 3 years ago. Community to come in and make any kind of a finding as to who was responsible. So we can't take their denial. It's denial, deflection, and deceit on their part. So I think that this does mark a change in our relationship with what President Trump hoped to have with Russia, and Russia is being exposed for what it really is, and that is a supporter of a really corrupt regime and a tyrannical one. So I think it's going to change our relationship, and it's going to, I think, cause President Trump to become more engaged. He wants to come back to America. He wants to have nation building here at home. But the reality is that the world's a dangerous place, that yes, he inherited it. He also campaigned for it. So now it's time for him to develop a strategy in dealing with all the disparate elements there are in the world, pulling his team together, beefing up the State Department. Rex Tillerson needs a deputy. He needs a big staff to help him work all of these issues, because every single issue is related to the rest of the world. And you can't just do one piece at a time. It has to be comprehensive.
Stand by for a moment, Secretary Cohen. Jane Harman is still with us. Were you pleased or not pleased when the U.S. changed its strategy towards the Syrian regime last night by launching this first U.S. strike against the Syrian military target?
I was pleased, and I wish that President Obama had done this in 2013 when at least half his advisors urged him to, and when Syria was a simpler problem. But I wouldn't call last night, I agree with Bill Cohen, and I said it earlier, I wouldn't call that a strategy, I would call that a tactic. The question is, what is the strategy? And I'm urging that Congress engage here, because it's Congress's role to authorize the use of military force, and that would help bring the expertise that Congress clearly has on both sides of the aisle. People calling for this today, I think, are John McCain, Lindsey Graham, Tim Kaine, and others. And Congress should stay in session. That's something Nancy Pelosi has urged. The Senate, I guess, is just adjourning now after the vote on Gorsuch. They should stay in session. They should do this now. And then the Trump administration, working with them, ought to show some bipartisanship and clear American resolve to solve this.
Can I just say, I mean, one of the issues with Congress, though, is that Congress, and I think Jane would agree with this, has totally shirked its responsibility for years now and failed. Yes. It hadn't had the guts to have a real debate about how much power the president should have. And President Obama was happy to keep all this executive authority, just like President Bush was. And now, but there should be a broader strategy, because there's a big question here. Do you want to take out the Assad leadership, his regime, or do you just want to target ISIS? Because the strategy from Obama to Trump was, we're just going after ISIS. That's what Putin wants as well. He wants to keep his guy there and just focus on ISIS. I think that'll be part of the backdrop of their meeting next week.
You're suggesting this is not necessarily a one-off. This is the beginning of a new a series of actions potentially against the Syrian military.
Absolutely. I mean, she said it herself. We're prepared to do more. You have to expect that what she means is more strikes like this, retaliatory or punitive strikes on the Assad regime and their infrastructure. When you do that now, you are in new territory. You're in new waters. Up to now, the fight has been against ISIS and ISIS only, and we've been working on an AUMF that was designed for Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and Congress wasn't willing to give President Obama a new AUMF. But when you start going after the regime now, that's a whole different scenario altogether. The other thing that they need to worry about, in addition to authorities, and I agree with Jane that they need to have a robust discussion on the Hill, is expectation management. Now you're starting to see Turkey applauded these strikes, and now they're calling for no-fly zones. Opposition groups are now applauding these strikes, and now they want and will probably expect more aggressive military action on the ground.
The other point I would make on that is that this was very tailored to chemical weapons, this strike, and that you can putatively say is just Syria, although the Pentagon's now investigating whether Russia was involved in that chemical weapons strike. But if you do broader attacks on the Syrian military, that is a more direct confrontation with Russia, because Syria is Russia's client state there. They've specifically re-engaged in Syria to protect that client state. That would really put you at odds with Russia.
They have no love of Assad, but they don't want to see that regime collapse in a chaotic, unstructured way.
The Iranians don't either.
No, they don't. And Russia has a long defense relationship with Syria. They don't want to give up their foothold in the Middle East.
You know, Secretary Cohen, a quick question to Secretary Cohen. Should the Trump administration now wait for congressional action, passing of legislation authorizing the use of military force before taking additional direct military action against various Syrian military targets?
I think the president always has the power to act unilaterally when time does not allow for a full discussion. I think this action was authorized. I don't think he had to go to Congress for this power. But to the extent this is the beginning of something much larger and is going to affect multiple parties, multiple countries, then I think it's time for Congress at least to have the opportunity to be heard. I don't expect them to be overwhelmingly in favor of any action. As has been pointed out by David Gregory, Congress has not exactly been a braveheart when it comes to making decisions on critical issues.
Jane Harman, very quickly,
but
you
on
agree?
Congress, yeah, well, Congress has not been a braveheart, and Congress doesn't want to own this problem. So on both sides, they've let the president do what he does, and then if it goes wrong, it's his fault. But I think that time has to be over. This is way too serious, and our engagement in the world is at issue, and getting the Middle East right would be an enormous victory for the Trump administration.
Everybody stand by. There's more news coming in, including Donald Trump's about face when it comes to Syria after directing these military strikes. How will all this impact his America First policy? The White House press secretary, Sean Spicer, just had an off-camera briefing. We're going to get an update on that when we come back. Timeline that led to the U.S. Tomahawk cruise missile strikes on that Syrian air base. Let's go to our senior White House correspondent, Jeff Zeleny. Jeff, what did you hear from Sean Spicer?
Well, Sean Spicer did articulate the timeline that the president went through really starting Tuesday morning at 10:30 a.m. that led to his final decision around 4 o'clock or so on Thursday afternoon when he made that decision to strike and go ahead with this. But Wolf, we also learned another interesting piece of information, how the president informed his Chinese counterpart that in fact he had ordered these military strikes in Syria. Now, Sean Spicer said, and really revealing this for the first time, that it was after the dinner, after their dinner last evening, this bilateral dinner that was supposed to be the focal point of this big week of foreign policy for this administration, that the U.S. president reached out to his Chinese counterpart, President Xi Jinping, and said, look, I have made this strike against Syria. He said, Spicer said this, after the dinner had concluded, the impact had already been made. It happened around 8:30 or so, those strikes started, but the president informed President Xi that that was happening. Well, so this, of course, security and threats have been a central part of this meeting here at Mar-a-Lago, the threats of North Korea. But the fact that, on the eve of their big discussion this morning, that President Trump had to inform his counterpart of this strike, his first use of military action, certainly changed the tone of this meeting here. But otherwise, Wolf, we have not heard from the president yet today on the Syria strike. His advisors are briefing folks on Capitol Hill and others trying to answer the central question here: what is next for this policy going forward? The administration has yet to articulate if this will change its policy towards Syria. Sean Spicer pushed back on the notion that this will interrupt the fight against ISIS here. But of course, that's what Russia and some other critics of this action are saying, Wolf.
Jeff Zeleny down in Palm Beach for us, covering the president's stay down there. Important talks with the leader of China as well. Jeff, we'll get back to you. Thanks very much. And that's it for me. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be back 5 p.m. Eastern in the Situation Room. The news here on CNN, and there's lots of it.